Hello. So today we're going to be looking at the three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. In videos to come, we're going to look at each one of these branches of government separately. So today's going to really be a broad overview of all three to kind of really give you the intuition of how it works and the interactions between these separate branches. So to begin with, the legislative branch of government is the branch of government that we say passes the laws. So they're going to pass all the legislation to govern our country. The executive branch of government is the branch of government that enforces the laws. So they enforce the laws that the legislative branch of government have passed. And finally, the judicial branch of government is the branch of government that interprets the laws that were passed by the legislative and then enforced by the executive. So you could see kind of how they all interplay with each other. But what's really important about our system of government is that these three branches of government are quite separate from each other. So you could kind of pretend that there's a line in between them. But there is some interaction, and we'll see in subsequent videos that different systems of government have different interactions. In the US, for example, there's less interaction between these two, the legislative and the executive. And in our system, in the Canadian system of government, there's much more interaction in between, especially these two branches of government. But we're going to get into those details a bit later. For now, I'm just going to really give the elements that make up each branch of government, and then we'll take it from there. So the legislative branch of government is made up of two elements. The first one would be the sovereign. So we might not think of the sovereign when we think of the legislative branch of government, because the sovereign is really Queen Elizabeth II. It's the Queen of, she's the Queen of Canada, first of all, but she's the Queen of England. That's how most of us think about her on a daily basis. So obviously, being the Queen of England, she doesn't live in Canada. She lives back in England, in London. So she has a permanent representative here. And her permanent representative in Canada is the Governor General, who used to be actually named by the Queen, but since we have our independence and everything, the Governor General is actually recommended by the Prime Minister and then approved by the Queen. But in all seriousness, it's the Prime Minister who appoints the Governor General. So that's our first element, is the sovereign of Canada. The second element of the legislative branch of government is Parliament, so the institution of Parliament. And Parliament itself is broken down into two elements, for lack of a better word. The first is, or two houses, I should say, actually. It's probably a better way of saying it. The upper house. So the upper house, as many of you I'm sure will know, is the Senate. They've been in the news lately, so it wouldn't surprise me if many of you have already seen or heard of the Senate. And currently in Canada, we have room for 105 senators. It doesn't mean that there are actually 105 senators currently sitting in the Senate. Some of them might have retired and we're waiting for a few to be appointed. But there are 105 seats that we have for the Senate in Canada. What's interesting to note about our Senate in Canada is that they are appointed. And again, that's been in the news lately. So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of you guys knew about that. And what the federal government is currently trying to do is to try and either amend it, so make them that they could be elected, or you could elect a list, so a few people, and then the federal government would choose from that list. Or finally, we're even thinking of abolishing the Senate, so only having one house. Now this is the upper house, and we're going to see the lower house soon, but they're thinking of just completely abolishing this whole Senate. That might seem extreme, but it's also interesting to note that none of our provinces have an upper house and a lower house. They only have one house. So it wouldn't be unprecedented to abolish our Senate in Canada. It's been done at the provincial levels. And they are appointed, as I said. And another interesting tidbit of them is they are also, they represent geographic areas. So I'll just write geo. And that means that, well, I'll explain it by explaining what the other house is, and that would be, if we have the upper house on one side, the other would be the lower house. So the lower house. And these are, they're called members, MPs, members of parliament. And they are the lower house. They are not appointed, they are elected. Elected. And finally, they don't represent a geographic area, they're actually represented by population. So I'll say pop. Now what this means basically is that, we all know the biggest city in Canada is Toronto. So in Toronto, there's going to be several MPs because there's so many people in that small area, right? So it's a population-based vote that they're elected on. Now, since we have, most people in Canada live in the province of Ontario, you could see that it might be unfair. Other provinces might think, well, Ontario's getting all these elected members because it has so many people. It has about, I think it's 13 million people in Ontario. And whereas, say, Newfoundland has almost no, has not that many people compared to Ontario, so they're not going to have that much representation. So the Senate, part of the role of this, the idea of the Senate was that they were not going to be based on population, but geography. They were going to give more voice to the the geographic areas, the provinces in Canada that had less people. So that was the balancing act. That was part of the idea of having these two, the upper and lower house. One was population based, the other was geographic based to kind of, make sure that everything equaled out. Now, whether that happened in practice is, it's really debatable, but that's the idea behind it. And we're going to go more into that when we see the legislative branch of government. But basically, there's the sovereign and the parliament. And then the parliament's made up of the upper house and the lower house. And this is the branch of government that passes laws. So I could even write that up here. They pass laws. The executive branch of government now is made up of three elements itself. We're going to put an arrow there because the sovereign's here, but the sovereign is also part of the executive branch of government. And in this, as a legislative, what they do is these guys pass the laws, but they have to be signed off by the Governor General, the Queen. This is, in official jargon, you would call this royal assent. To give a bill royal assent. Basically, it's just stamping the bill saying we approve it. And you need all these elements in order for a bill to become law. You need these three. The sovereign also plays a role in the executive. But the one that, the important ones would be the Prime Minister of Canada, and finally the Cabinet. So let's go into a bit of what each one of these elements represents. The sovereign, as we said, was the Governor General, is the head of the armed forces, for example. So that would be a role that the Governor General plays. Oftentimes, it's up to the Governor General whether they're going to wear a military uniform when they go to military events. But a lot of them choose to do that because they are the head, the commander-in-chief of the Canadian forces. So that's one role, for example, that the sovereign plays. The Queen Elizabeth II, who is represented by the Governor General. So that's what I mean by the sovereign again. But the big elements are really number 2 and 3, the Prime Minister. So I wrote PM here for Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is actually the head of Cabinet. And Cabinet in Canada is actually quite a bit of people. I think it's one of the most in Western democracies. I think we have over 40 people in Cabinet. And basically what Cabinet is the head of each government department. So we have a lot of government departments. For example, the Ministry of National Defense. It's actually called D&D for Department of National Defense. But the MND would be the Minister of National Defense. So all of these ministers of all these different departments, they sit around one big table called Cabinet, and the Prime Minister is the head of Cabinet, and they decide what direction the country should go to, what kind of policies the government should adopt. Should we have a free trade agreement with Europe, for example? These are the kind of things that cabinet will decide. But it's very influenced by the laws that are passed by the legislative branch of government. So they can't do whatever they want. They don't have carte blanche to do anything. They really have to abide by the laws of Canada that are passed by the legislative government. So you already see a bit of the interaction happening between the executive and the legislative. So again, the executive here, these guys are going to enforce the laws. So they're going to, I'll write it up here, enforce laws. And then that brings us to our third branch of government, which is the judicial. The judicial branch of government interprets laws, and that's basically our court system. And I'll kind of draw it up here really quickly. We're going to have the federal courts. And I put an S because there are many different courts, but we're not going to go into all of that. Here I'll put it provincial courts, and I'll put federal courts of appeal, or the federal court of appeal rather. And then here I'll put provincial courts of appeal. And then finally up here I'll put Supreme Court of Canada, the highest court of appeal in Canada. And I wasn't going to do this, but here I'll put tribunals. And I'll put an S and put it in the middle because there are provincial and federal tribunals, so I should have probably put two, but I'll just kind of save a bit of time and put one here. But you should know that there's actually, a line across here. There's federal tribunals and there's provincial tribunals. And you could appeal to the, depending, sometimes directly up to the courts of appeal, but oftentimes it'll be directly to here. And you should know that. I'm not going to try and go into too much detail here. I'm just going to give a general idea of the court system. We're going to look into this more closely when we look at it. But essentially you should know that there's the federal courts system and then the provincial court system. And that at every instance you could appeal to the next court, and all these kind of funnel into the Supreme Court of Canada. So the Supreme Court of Canada is able to hear all cases that come for judicial review or other kind of mechanisms, and they have the last word. Anything they say is binding onto all the other courts down here. And that's really the judicial branch of government. They give meaning to law. Oftentimes we say they give meaning to laws. And what we'll say though is they interpret the law. And by interpreting law, they give meaning to law because, they're different words and they're going to give meaning to the words. They're going to define words. They're going to either give them very narrow in scope, so that means the government can't do very much. There's not much wiggle room, or there is going to be broad scope. That means that, the government, for example, could do a lot. They have a lot of wiggle room to do what they please within that law. So these are really the three branches of government that I wanted to, the intuition I wanted to get across, where the legislative branch of government over here, they pass the laws. The executive branch of government, that's really what we call the government, and they enforce the laws. And finally, the judicial branch of government interprets the laws. And just one more thing before we go is oftentimes you'll hear on the news, the government passed this law. And as we could just see by this, the government can't pass a law because this is the government. The government is cabinet and the prime minister. We should always say on the news, we should hear the legislative branch of government passed a law because it's not the government. This is the government here, that right now it's the conservative governing power and the prime minister is Stephen Harper. So it would be Stephen Harper's, his government basically. But he doesn't pass laws by any means. It's the legislative branch of government that passes laws in our system, and it's really important to understand that nuance, and especially as we get more into detail of each one. So I hope that was useful for you and that you kind of get a better idea of the intuition of the three branches of government, and we'll get into more next time. So have a good night.